Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And welcome to the Korea Society. It's our pleasure to have you here today. I'm Stephen Noerper. I'm the Senior Director for Policy, and we're delighted to have so many friends and regulars here in the audience. We'd also like to welcome those joining us via live stream or listening via audio podcast or watching via our YouTube channel. And I really wanted to extend a special welcome to Nick Bratt of our board, who's here today, as well as Barbara Demick, who is a journalist and author of great renown, and we're just delighted to have her here with us. And welcome to the Korea Society. It is my pleasure to welcome Jung H, who has come up from Washington, D.C. to join us. You may have seen her most recently on Face the Nation with David Sanger and Mike Morrell. Jung is a formidable thought leader in the Korean studies community. She has served wonderfully at the Central Intelligence Agency and has taken the lead now at Brookings and really is an intellectual force, as you will hear, to inform us and to guide us in some of our thoughts as we look forward to the summit process, if it occurs. Jung, welcome. Thanks for making the effort. She and I both flew in from the West Coast yesterday, so thanks for the extra special effort.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
And it is great to have you here on the Korea Society stage for a first time. We know you have your roots here in New York as well, between Columbia and Hunter, so it's great to have you back in New York City. Where have we come just in the 2 weeks since this appearance in terms of now North Korea reaching out, looking to China, looking to Russia for some support, the White House having made some personnel changes, but seemingly a commitment on both sides toward a summit. Is it still, in your opinion, too big to fail?
I don't even remember what happened in the 2 weeks. Things with respect to North Korea happen at the speed of Kim Jong Un, right? I think 2 weeks ago we were talking about President Trump saying yes to, he was willing to talk to Kim Jong Un and meet him for a summit. Usually summits of this nature happen at the end of a very long process where all the diplomats and all the working level people have worked out all the details, all the minutia, and that the summit between two leaders is a way to just put the stamp of approval on it. I see lots of problems and risks associated with this meeting if it does happen, and I would say that I'm probably on the probably will happen side of the spectrum. And this is what I see North Korea doing. When North Korea, in Kim Jong Un in his New Year's address said that he was willing to attend the Olympics, I thought, oh, geez, this is trouble. Trouble on so many different levels. One, because I think the Trump administration, first of all, should be credited for harnessing all of the collective energy of the international community and applying maximum pressure on North Korea. And as hard as maximum pressure and getting the international community on board with pressuring North Korea, it's even more difficult and more complicated when North Korea is on this engagement tactic. It requires a lot of coordination. It requires a lot of long meetings, most of them dull, talking about the nitty-gritty details of coordinating with allies, coordinating with our partners and other stakeholders, and trying to do that while you're trying to continue the sanctions regime. So when Kim sent his sister and the Olympic delegation to South Korea, I thought, okay, we all have to get our acts together. And when the South Korean envoys went to Pyongyang and Kim reportedly expressed a willingness to talk about denuclearization, and then President Trump accepted this offer to meet with Kim, I thought it has to be all hands on deck for this type of affair. And here I see the convergence of a lot of disturbing factors. One is we have a U.S. president that is suspicious of alliances in general, and this is not a new thought that he's had, who has focused on on burden sharing and the costs that that our allies impose on us. Just the other day, he talked about how he's going to he's not going to approve the revised chorus until he said we'll see what happens with North Korea first. And this is not a new belief that he's had. 3, we have a new national security advisor. So we're in this weird realm of outgoing national security advisor, incoming national security advisor, John Bolton, who is reportedly thinking about a purge of the National Security Council. And that creates a lot of tension within the bureaucracy. Who are we listening to? What kind of policies are we following? And what are we supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis? So we have we have this domestic internal turmoil within the administration. But the other thing too is that I found that I think that Kim Jong Un is much more adroit at handling the engagement side than we thought. So after 6+ years of eschewing any kind of engagement with anybody except for Dennis Rodman and the family sushi chef, he's now on a summit spree. The South Koreans and the North Koreans are busy working to have an inter-Korean summit at the end of this month, and probably preparing for a summit with the U.S. president. And Kim went to Beijing to meet with President Xi. I didn't think that was going to happen. I thought that if anything, that Kim would receive a Chinese delegation in Pyongyang, so that he can control the optics of the Chinese going to him to figure out what's going on. But in fact, he himself went to Beijing. And I have to admit that I was surprised by that. It suggests to me that he's much more confident about his position and his standing than I thought. And that, and his poise and his seeming confidence when he was meeting with Xi and his wife and attending those concerts. This is what he wanted. He wanted the red carpet, the literal red carpet rolled out for him in Beijing. And he went to shows, he waved goodbye to Xi and his wife, and they seemed very comfortable. So in essence, Kim got what he wanted, which was international prestige. Would anybody care if he went to China? Would anybody be following that armored train that rolled through Northeast in the way that we were looking at the O.J. Simpson, the Bronco in the 90s? So I think Kim has shown to be very adroit at this engagement side, this charm offensive. He's taking the charm offensive from his father's and grandfather's playbook, trying to drive wedges between China, the U.S. and South Korea, and also, add in a mix of Russia as well. But it's new for him. And at 34 years old, 6+ years in power, he's shown that he can do those missile launches and continue to cross those lines. Continue to improve the nuclear weapons program, but also engage in dialogue and to play the international or the regional dynamics for his benefit. So I see, the convergence of some of the things that are happening with the Trump administration and some of the policy dysfunction that are observable from the outside on the U.S. side, plus Kim's growing confidence and expertise in the way he deals with foreign relationships, I think make for a very troubling trajectory of Northeast Asia dynamics.
Interesting. I mean, you say troubling. So some people on the engagement path may say an opportunity, but clearly it's going to be a complex that will have to be managed, and maybe we can get to that a bit more in a minute. But since we're on Kim Jong Un and the like father, like grandfather, or maybe in some ways unlike, growing confidence is one. How do you factor in the impact of sanctions as a motivation? And how would you look at the second part of his Byung policy on economic engagement and modernization? Is he moving beyond the nuclear issue, or it's still nukes are here, but I know I need to upgrade the economy?
I think it's still not clear how much sanctions are having an effect on his approach to foreign affairs and to external affairs. But let's say they're biting. That means that, sure, maximum pressure worked, and that's what the Trump administration has been saying, that maximum pressure has brought forth all these summits and this bounty of charm offensive. But that doesn't seem to have tamped down on Kim's self-perception of how he can manage things. So one of the questions that keeps getting asked is he doing outreach as a sign? Is his outreach a sign of his weakness or his strength? And I think that's not the right question to ask. Sanctions could be biting and he could be feeling it, but he thinks that he can manage it by having these summits. And by having this charm offensive, he can take the wind out of the sails of maximum pressure, or try to. But let's say sanctions aren't biting yet. That means that he's able to think ahead strategically and plan. And that he might be getting the right information from his advisors or the people who are close to him. That he sees what sanctions are doing or what the outcome might be, and that he's planning way in advance of before the sanctions can apply that critical pressure. That's also a scary scenario too. That he can plan this type of strategically about how he's managing his country. So when he first came to power, there was a lot of jokes about how he's so young, how he's so overweight, how he's so odd looking, and his behavior is so strange. And there's no way that he could, stand to rule this country for much longer. But what we're seeing is somebody who can do things militarily, might be possibly thinking ahead about how to mitigate the sanctions' impact on his economy, and also managing multiple diplomatic balls, China, South Korea, and the US, as well as probably Russia.
Since we spent time then on Kim Jong Un, how do you factor in then Moon Jae-in and the South Korean side of this process and the lead that they feel they've taken? And also, frankly, what may be the difficulties with all of these changes in Washington to try to see how it's registering and to keep U.S.-South Korea relations without light between them?
6 months ago, when now close to a year ago, when President Moon came to power in South Korea, there was a lot of talk about Korea passing. That was the dominant narrative. I remember it was that Trump and Moon don't get along. The summit didn't go great. Moon doesn't have the same chemistry as Abe does with Trump. Trump and Abe are moving forward on maximum pressure without South Korea. There was a lot of talk about military strikes against North Korea. So the dominant narrative was Korea passing, and that Korea was being sidelined. Fast forward a year, we're not talking about Korea passing anymore. We're talking about Japan passing. We're talking about China passing until the Kim visit to China happened. And the narrative now is South Korea in the driver's seat. What is puzzling to me, I think, in many ways, is the idea that South Korea is mediating between North Korea and the U.S., when I think it should be the U.S. and South Korea working on the North Korea issue problem, right? I understand the way I explain or think about what motivated President Moon to open this dialogue channel and grab this opportunity in engaging with North Korea is that I think the talk about limited strikes on North Korea really did make the Moon administration nervous about what could happen. President Moon came into office saying, he wanted to peacefully resolve things on the Korean Peninsula, and that engagement and a new economic map was a critical component of any kind of inter-Korean peace. And he's fulfilled some of those pledges. But with Kim's charm offensive, it's even more important for the allies, the US, South Korea, Japan, China, and Russia, as well as the Europeans, to be coordinating and on the phone constantly about how to provide this united front. One of the time-old tactics that North Korea has used, even before Kim's time, is to try to divide and conquer. And I see that happening in the ways that Prime Minister Abe is trying to make sure that his equities are protected. He's trying to talk about abductees, talking about shorter range ballistic missiles are on the agenda. Not getting as much traction as probably he would like, and they're national priorities that are coming to the fore as a result of Kim's charm offensive. So North Korea helped us a lot in the past year because they were so bad, and because they were so bad, it was much easier to coalesce around this common threat. But now the fissures in the way the different countries think about the North Korea threat are bubbling up to the surface. I'll point to the U.S. national security strategy, which says that North Korea seeks nuclear weapons to kill millions of Americans. I think most Korea watchers would say that that's not why the North Koreans are advancing their nuclear weapons capability, but that's the U.S. threat perception. South Koreans and Japanese and the Chinese have been living under this threat for a long time. So they see the development of the ICBM, or the intercontinental ballistic missile, as another part of the spectrum. But as I think the South Korean president sees the U.S. as creating, or the talk about limited military strikes as creating more problems than it is trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. So let me inject a bit of urgency to the process then, because of what you've mentioned about last year's behavior, where we saw this unprecedented testing of missiles, upgrades, and the ICBMs twice in July and once in November. That creates really a dire security prospect, and this is what was handed over and what what we understand to be the one classified briefing between the Obama and the Trump administration on national security. So we're left with something that the incoming Secretary of State has said will reach fruition within a few months. We're in a process where it looks like we have a bunch of smaller negotiations leading up to the summit, meaning that we have Japan, U.S., we have the all-important, as you've mentioned, inter-Korean summit. We have these offings between North Korea and China and Russia. Then we get to the big May summit meeting, which maybe you can help us define how that's declared a success or not. If not, then are we back to the situation of ratcheted tensions, or we at an even higher level of tension where a military option is even more likely because it's now at the senior-most leadership level? Right.
There are a couple of ways that things could go wrong. And I think here personality matters so much. So let me try to dissect the personality issue. Kim doesn't like to back down or be seen as backing down, relishes confrontation, and as what we saw in the back and forth with President Trump last fall with mentally deranged versus short and fat, and you're all familiar with the story, that he's not afraid to go head to head, in the way that he's not afraid to go head to head with President Xi in going to China as his equal. Or having a renewed stature in the region. So Kim doesn't like to be seen as backing down. And I think he's doing this, the charm offensive, as part of Kim's way of bounding the conversation with Trump. in having these meetings and reportedly talking about denuclearization as long as security guarantees are on the table, as long as dialogue is on the table, which we typically see as his way of saying that he's not going to give up nuclear weapons unless the U.S. is off the Korean Peninsula, which is a non-starter. Kim is trying to bound the conversation by saying all these wonderful things that his father and his grandfather used to say. And because he had been standoffish for so long, that we're all taking this as, this is great. But we have to take it with a grain of salt. I'm completely on board with using dialogue and engagement, as well as pressure, which is policy, to try to get Kim to reorient Kim in his thinking about nuclear weapons and his role in the world. But Kim is setting the agenda for his summit with Trump, talking about security guarantees, talking about denuclearization, and the Trump administration has been talking about how, yes, this is proof that maximum pressure is working. President Trump himself said Kim is sincere. The South Korean foreign minister said Kim is sincere. I think there's a big danger in characterizing these comments that Kim said as sincerity, or that it is a sign that he is making a strategic shift. But this is much more of a tactical shift in the way he's managing the international community, and not a sign that he's willing to give up nuclear weapons. So he's bounding that conversation and setting the agenda for the Kim-Trump summit to have insurance policies that, in case something happens, that we don't have a plan, that the U.S. does not go back into locked and loaded and fire and fury, especially with the new national security advisor who is on record as being opposed to negotiated or phased agreements, and has and sees North Korea as an evil threat to be countered militarily as necessary. So Kim is setting the agenda for the summit.
And you seem particularly concerned about Bolton, and I know that many of us share that concern, but you're not about Pompeo so much. How do you sort of see this new alignment, pushing? We don't have the reining in of Trump that the McMaster, Tillerson, Mattis factor was once upon a time, even a year ago.
I mean, it's all a package, I think. And one of the things that was important to me as an analyst on the intelligence side is that everybody was heard. All the voices were heard. There was this, whenever you write for the president or any paper goes out of the building, there is this massive coordination process with not just people in your office, but people at all the other agencies. You were at state, everything gets coordinated with state, everything gets coordinated with the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the whole alphabet soup of organizations that work on North Korea. And why that's important is that this is where all the analytical debates get hashed out. And if they're dissents, they're dissents. And we explain why they're dissents, or we explain why we analyze something a certain way. Here are the caveats, and this is our confidence level. So it's an art form. And what, as a North Korea analyst, I think we wonder about what is the groupthink around Kim Jong Un, right? And I think groupthink in general is a dangerous thing. I think when we're looking at North Korea, because it's so unpredictable and so opaque, that you have to be flexible and agile in the way you incorporate new information, and how and recalibrate your analysis based on what's going on. So I think, so I worry about having all the talk about military strikes The fact that we have in the incoming Secretary of State and the incoming National Security Advisor people who are not averse to military strikes, I think that's a worrisome trend.
If I can ask a final question before we turn to our audience here, and that really pulls at the headlines of the day, which is the U.S.-China trade war. And you mentioned how quickly this development in terms of Korea has been. Similarly, the last 11 hours seem to have been a whirlwind in terms of the back and forth between the United States and China. The U.S. is relying on China, at least the White House, for some management on the North Korea situation. Do you see the Sino-U.S. relationship and all its complexities and now this new reality of disagreement on trade impacting cooperation on the Korean Peninsula?
At the same time that we're having this trade issue with China, China and South Korea are mending ties on the economic front. So I think when we're looking at in confronting North Korea, it's not so it's as much about North Korea, but it's also about the U.S. credibility and standing in the region and the commitment to peace and stability and prosperity in Northeast Asia. And here on the trade issue, the domestic priorities get conflated with foreign policy. Priorities, and I think that gets very murky in terms of are you looking at national security issues and how are you looking at domestic trade issues, and are you looking at your base? So I think the whole trade issue in general, and the Trump administration's approach on trade with China and with South Korea and Japan, I think are at a minimum, not helping matters in getting cooperation on the North Korea issue.
Were you startled by the move on Chorus and this linkage to the North Korea talks? Many of us found it very much a non sequitur, and we don't really see the flush there.
Right. And that's what it's a prime example of how the domestic issues are coming to the fore on national security priorities, but also in that. What I saw in that statement was the layer of mistrust, or that lies underneath the surface of what South Korea is doing with North Korea, and to make sure, I think maybe it was a signal to South Korea to say, don't do anything foolish when it comes to North Korea because we can hold back the chorus. That was very odd. I think there's the idea that being unpredictable in the Trump administration is helping us with our adversaries, including North Korea. But unpredictability doesn't work very well with our allies and partners, and in making sure that they know that we're committed to the region and that we stand with our allies.
An extremely important cautionary. Dr. Pak, thank you. And now I'd like to turn to your questions, please. If we could pass the microphone. Yeah, thank you. If you would just state who you are and your affiliation, that would be great. It should be.
Hi, I'm Barbara Demick. I'm with the LA Times. Thanks, that's fascinating. Could you go back to the subject of your title, Too Big to Fail, which is a great peg. I mean, could you give us some scenarios of what might happen? Would you expect some kind of bland, face-saving communique to come out of a summit? What are the scenarios, positive and I guess negative also?
Too big to fail because when you have two leaders meeting, this is the first time that a sitting U.S. president will be meeting with the North Korea's leader. There's nowhere to go but down. I think the best case scenario is where we reach maybe a bland communique. And have the bureaucracies and the policy process come in and fill in the gaps on how to make that happen. Confidence building measures, what reciprocal steps can be taken to make sure that North Korea is doing what it's supposed to be doing. But I think, given the personalities, I worry that they'll get along too well, and that they'll get along, or that they won't get along at all. They don't get along at all. President Trump thinks that he really already has a win by getting Kim Jong Un to say that he wants to talk and that he wants to talk about denuclearization. And he's been told by his advisors that, go in strong, show strength, don't back down. Kim is hearing the same things from his advisors. So the two sides get together. They don't like to back down. They dig in their heels, and confrontation ensues. And we're left. And President Trump says, "I've tried engagement. I was sincere in my efforts to talk to Kim about denuclearization and to improve U.S.-North Korea ties. This is why why military options are the only options that are likely to get Kim to give up his nuclear weapons." But let's say they do get along. And I can envision this happening. So far, they've said nothing about the 3 U.S. citizens in North Korea. I can see North Korea using the American citizens as a dangle to get the president closer to Pyongyang or closer to the North Korea, because the venue is still being worked out. So that they can hand over the U.S. citizens. President Trump hails this as a victory. It's a very apparent victory. And then Kim works off of that, this good feeling, and taps into America First national priorities. And Kim says, "You're right about intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are the ballistic missiles that can potentially hit the U.S. We'll talk about dismantling that program, but the other missiles are off the table, and the allies are left to fend for themselves." President Trump says, "This is a win for America." And he's already suspicious of allies and placing too much of a burden on us anyway. My priority is to make sure that American lives are safe. So this is great. Let's work on the ICBMs, but forget the other stuff. That leaves Japan and South Korea in a bit of in no man's land, where they're still under the threat of short and medium range ballistic missiles. And it shows that the U.S. can't be trusted to fend for the allies or to live up to alliance commitments. It shows China that U.S. is retreating from the region. So those are two different scenarios, different and bad for different reasons. So I think that's what we might see. I'm worried about the American citizens and what they might do to try to get the president to grease the process of trying to give the president a win very early on in the process. And I think it's the too big to fail is that we have these two leaders who are alike in a lot of different ways. Dennis Rodman, when he last went to North Korea, gave his North Korean interlocutors a copy of The Art of the Deal. Kim is pretty media savvy, and he keeps up to date with the news. When the South Korean envoys went to Pyongyang, he was self-deprecating. He was charming. He said, "I know how the outside world thinks of me." And the North Korean diplomats, their jobs are to read everything that's out there on North Korea. And a few months ago, there were reports about how the North Koreans are trying to get in touch with think tankers who might be close to the Trump administration. And I saw that as a sign that they're trying to figure out this administration as much as a lot of people are. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if the North Koreans are reading the types of things that President Trump has written or was ghostwritten by others, and looking at the way the president is looking at deals and deal making, looking at the president's statements on the China trade issue, about burden sharing with respect to South Korea and Japan, that Kim might see the weak links in that chain.
In terms of their perceptions of their role, there's been a lot made of Trump as a transactional president, as the art of the deal. But some suggestion that he sees himself as a transitional president or wants to be Reagan-esque in many ways. The North Korean vice foreign minister in a meeting in Kuala Lumpur had with him a book, and I asked, and he said it's about Gorbachev and Reykjavik and Reagan. And I think the North Koreans actually see this as that type of thing. They were talking about themselves at that time, at that meeting, as the new Soviets, which might make some people chuckle. But what they were trying to say is they feel they've reached a level. And they said, we want to be seen as one of three powers in the Pacific. Our question to them was, well, what are the three powers then? And they said the United States, China, and ourselves. And so there's no underestimating that level of where they see it. I think some people have suggested, well, maybe it's sort of a Kim Il-sung, Jimmy Carter meeting. But I think they see that, or he sees himself perhaps as wanting to break and be even more dramatic than perhaps his father appeared to be at times.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it's that strategic relevance that they get from having these weapons. That drive a lot of these efforts toward advancing these weapons programs, and why they're not going to give it up, because it gives them relevance, it gives them prestige, and I want to remind others too that it might not always be about us. That there might be domestic drivers behind Kim's outreach at this time. I do think it's a mix of both. They're external and internal drivers. But the internal drivers, we're going to have the 70th anniversary of North Korea's founding. So while the past 6 years has been Kim developing these advanced weapon systems, when we have the summits, when we have the Kim presiding over boy bands, the South Korean boy bands that are coming to visit, or that Kim is seen meeting with the Chinese president, meeting with Putin, or meeting with President Trump. He's not just in charge of the nuclear weapons, but he's also in charge of the neighborhood. That he's relevant and that he's here to stay.
Thank you, Dr. Puck. Please, John.
Thank you. John Koch. I'm a political historian. I'd just like you to talk a little bit about the choreography of these serial summits that are taking place. Let me just elaborate on that. Is it incumbent on Moon to visit Beijing or Washington, either or both, because Kim did it? Is there any relevance in terms of the 2000 Pyongyang summit, which led to a breakthrough on the U.S.-North Korean side when Clinton hosted Jung H, and there was a communique which essentially ended was it hostility, but it didn't really end it for very long. What impact will the South Korean, will the Korean summit have on the U.S.-North Korean summit? And finally, is it going to be a one-day stand in Panmunjom, or what could conceivably happen in that initial interaction? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. I welcome that the South Koreans are going and debriefing their counterparts. The South Korean foreign minister talked to her counterpart in Japan. The South Korean delegation that went to Pyongyang to meet with Kim, did a circuit, and I think that's important. Substantively, but also for optics, that it shows that the South Koreans are being transparent, and that they're telling all of their friends and regional stakeholders about what transpired, but also to amplify what the South Korean policy preferences are to their neighbors. And I think that's a great thing for policy coordination, which is a critical thing. I think coordination is the key in the next few months as we build up to the summits. On the role of the Inter-Korean Summit leading up to the Kim-Trump Summit, I see I'm trying to figure out how North Korea sees the sequence of these events. The Xi visit was kind of like the appetizer to whet the appetite. And the Inter-Korean Summit doesn't count that much, but you need the South Koreans because they're your biggest advocate in the region. So it might be a second appetizer, but it's building up to the main course, which is the U.S. North Korea Summit. And I think that what is difficult in this situation is South Korea playing the role of the mediator? It says it is, but what does that mean for the U.S. role? They seem to be trying to lay the foundation for what the U.S. and North Korea should talk about. But the North Koreans don't like talking about nuclear issues with South Korea. They don't think it's an inter-Korean issue. So what might turn out is that the Inter-Korean Summit, they talk more about how to improve communications, improve coordination, intercultural exchanges, or continuing visits. That has implications for how the international community sees the maximum pressure campaign. Is China going to start loosening up the sanctions implementation as a result of the thaw in inter-Korean relations, or to ease or facilitate Pyongyang's entree into the world? So I think we need to have a very frank discussion with the South Koreans and with the Japanese on what do we want as the outcome of all of this, the spring of summits. Or is it going to be everybody fending for themselves in their various meetings with no strategic goal at the end of it? And that's what I'm most worried about, is where we're all working for our own national priorities instead of working in collaboration with each other on the North Korea issue. And as I and others have mentioned before, North Koreans like to divide and conquer, and I fear that that's what they're looking to do.
Thank you. Nick?
I'm Nick Bratt, Director of the Korea Society. Thank you very much for your comments. Could you envisage a set of circumstances or some realistic conditions that would actually convince the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons? And if you can't, then does the situation remain irresolvable, given what the US objective is, which is presumably to denuclearize the peninsula?
The U.S. goal of denuclearization of North Korea and North Korea's goal are fundamentally at odds with each other. And Kim Jong Un, more than his father and his grandfather, is personally and completely wedded to the program. The North Koreans often point to the Gaddafi example, the Libya example, and it makes sense to me. But I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. Gaddafi was killed in late 2011. Arab Spring came before that. And Gaddafi, and images of Gaddafi's beating, he was half naked, he was bloodied, he was stabbed, he was beaten by his own people and stored in a refrigerator. All that was happening when Kim was full on into the succession process. Now, when you're about to take control of a country under the tutelage of your father, and this is happening, Libya gave up its nuclear weapons. Its leader is being killed and maimed and sodomized by his own people. How does that not get seared into the brain of a young 20-something leader who's about, or 20-something-year-old person who's about to take control of your nuclear country? So I think that and the fact that Kim is the regime media continues to show Kim talking to the technicians, talking to the nuclear scientists, handling the warheads or looking at the warheads, giving guidance at these facilities, and being at the missile tests. He's very much wedded to this program. I also look back on his New Year's speech where he said that the nuclear button is in his office. It's his button. And this is, what led to this was in the midst of the whose button is bigger discussion. It's not in his family's office or his dynasty's office or the party office. It's in his office. So really, he's the only one who stands between complete annihilation of North Korea and peace and prosperity. But I think at the end of the day, Kim has to make a decision. Is he more afraid of the United States, which has never attacked North Korea in 70 years without nuclear weapons, even when they didn't have nuclear weapons, or of his own people who have rising expectations amid a regime-sponsored consumerist society? Who's he more afraid of?
Yeah. One of the things we heard from Evan Osnos and from Nick Kristof on their respective trips to North Korea is that North Korea is in its own space age, meaning the popular support and the popular mythology, even among young people, that has come up over this last year, and that a lot of the domestic credibility now is so tied into that one questions whether he would ever bargain that off. But let me ask you in relationship to that too, since you've mentioned Bolton, he may put the final nail in the coffin of the Iran agreement. Mm-hmm. And it would seem to me that the North Koreans would be looking at the Iran agreement very carefully to say whether the United States is reliable in terms of its position.
Yeah, I don't think that the North Koreans think that we are reliable. So I think the Iran, if the Iran deal goes away, it would just be another data point rather than, this is what they mean. This is the real United States. But I think while we think about things in terms of elections every 4 years, North Koreans think about things in terms of dynasties and legacies. And whatever they can't handle now, they'll just wait things out. Is what I think they might try to do, and to play dynamics in a way that are favorable to them. So I think the Iran example, I don't think that would be a game changer for them, because I already think that they think that.
Yeah, sure. It would confirm what you're saying on Libya and others. But one thing against waiting out would be they might not wait out Moon Jae-in, meaning that they may not get this opportunity, and they may instinctively know that. This is a South Korean administration with which they can work, and I wonder if that isn't part of the calculus.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that they might think that on the U.S. side that this might be an administration that might be more inclined to, like it or not, or inadvertently advance North Korea's objectives. The talk about President Trump's talk about totally destroying North Korea, and some of that war of words that went on, it has the effect of creating a rallying effect around North Korea's leader, whether you like him or not. That the U.S. is out to get us. The U.S. president said it himself in front of this international audience at the UN. So I think that the tough talk, it might work well for some constituencies, but it doesn't work well for trying to get the North Korean opinion toward or against Kim Jong Un. And I think, North Korea has been a nuclear state has had nuclear weapons since 2006 with its first nuclear test. We're gonna have generations of North Koreans who are growing up knowing North Korea as a nuclear capable country, and that it's going to be hard to wrest that from generations.
Dr. Pak, thank you. Let me take two final questions here on the front, and if we can just have them together, and then Dr. Pak can answer here in the interest of time. Dame Josetta.
Josetta Capriati, Foreign Policy Association. Kim Jong Un has mentioned once that he would like to sign a peace treaty with the US. Do you think this is a realistic goal when he meets with President Trump?
My question has more to do with why there seems to be so much optimism now, because I really don't see any reason for this optimism. As you mentioned, the positions are actually, the U.S. and the Korean Peninsula, North Korean Peninsula, are actually irreconcilable. And I just want to make a comment about Reykjavik. One of the problems with Reykjavik, if I recall correctly, is that Ronald Reagan offered to give up the farm. He offered to withdraw the nuclear umbrella from Europe for a pittance. And if that's what the North Koreans are thinking are going to happen, then wow. And I think that Trump is dumb enough to do that too.
I think those two questions are related. The peace treaty comment, that offer of a peace treaty, that's been something that the North Koreans have been saying for a long time, and it's a way of saying that we need a peace treaty, which means that there's no need for U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, the U.S., once there's a peace treaty, the U.S. should leave. What does that mean for U.S. troop presence in Japan? And that goes toward, that the talk about a peace treaty is one of the ways that the North Koreans try to mire the U.S. in non-nuclear discussions. Because when you start talking to the U.S. on non-nuclear things, it gives de facto legitimacy to the nuclear weapons, and as well as giving the prestige factor to the North Korean regime. So I don't see the peace treaty as a sincere thing that only if there's a peace treaty we'll give up our nuclear weapons and then there'll be peace on the Korean Peninsula. But in fact, I think the North Korea requires a hostile outside power to sustain itself, and the U.S. serves that role. As long as the U.S. is hostile, and that's a definition that only the North Koreans will define. What they've done in the past is, even during engagement, they'll point to something that the U.S. has done to say, "Oh, that's U.S. hostile policy. We're going to, withdraw from the agreement and or manufacture a crisis situation." So I think that the whole peace treaty concept, for the most part, is a move toward trying to get the U.S. to talk about something that's not nuclear at all. About the optimism, I think the optimism is because, for a lot of reasons, is Kim has never said these things. We've heard them. We've heard about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We've heard about peace treaty. We've heard about peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, a peace regime. But we haven't heard it from Kim Jong Un himself. And I think also that people are just relieved that we're not in what we were back in September, October, November, December, with the real fears about war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula. So, one of the things that I wondered about is, why was Kim doing all of these provocative things last fall? And I think it might be that he thinks that he can lock in some sort of concessions or agreements early on in the Trump administration so that he can cement it for the next 3 years, which is try to lure South Korea away from the U.S., erode U.S. commitment to the region, raise questions about the U.S. standing in the region, and continue to exacerbate those tensions and fissures.
Dr. Jung Pak, thank you for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you so much.
Barbara, Nick, thank you. We'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here at the Korea Society today, and we are most grateful to Dr. Jung Pak. I'd also like to point out a few other people. Jonathan Corrado in the front of the room, our Associate Director for Policy, who sets up all our logistics. Thank you, Jonathan. And a special thanks to Peter Stemke in our audio booth here. All of the audio and video you see is due to his great efforts. Toward the back of the room, I have a number of our interns and staff. Thank you very much for all of your kind consideration. And I would point out Chloe in the very back of the room, who has information on membership for you if you're not a member of the Korea Society. And I think I see almost complete membership here today. But do see her or see us online at koreasociety.org. And to all of those live streaming or joining us via audio podcast or YouTube video, thank you for your time and attention for for the Korea Society. Dr. Jung H, thanks. We hope to have you back often.
Thank you.
And consider this a home after the summit and before, and do consider this your home to the north of Brookings. And I know all of your fans here at Hunter and your Columbia days and my Columbia students, I'm sure, are very happy to be
Thanks for
watching
having
this
me.
on
This
video.
was great
Thank
fun.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.